Hello and welcome everybody to this Meet the Author event with Jan Stocklassa and his book, The Man Who Played with Fire. My name is Stina Cowan. I am the Educational and Cultural Programs Manager at the National Nordic Museum, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here today. This is a new program series that we are very excited about, and in addition to this first talk, we are also welcoming on November 3rd, Neil Price, a Viking scholar who is going to talk about his latest book, Children of Ash and Elm. And on December 1st, we have Danish author Lisbeth Zornig Andersen, who's going to talk about her self-biography, Anger is My Middle Name. We, of course, have a great slate of other virtual programs at the museum that I encourage you to check out our website to find out more information about. I want to mention on Thursday, October 22nd, we are doing another Crafts and Cocktails, which is always a fun time. And a week from today, October 25th, we are hosting our first virtual Wallenberg event. And this is a not to be missed event. And then on October 29th, we are hosting Professor Pat Berman, who is going to talk about Munch and his photography. And this, of course, is in conjunction with the new exhibit, The Experimental Self, Edvard Munch's Photography, which will be on display beginning on October 29th. So please check all those things out. And we are very happy to have you here for this event today. This Meet the Author series is a partnership with Elizabeth DeNoma, and we are so grateful to have her be part of this, both in developing the program and as functioning as a moderator. So thank you, Elizabeth. Before I introduce Elizabeth a little bit further, I want to ask you all to please turn off your microphones and your cameras, as that will be easier for everybody to focus on what's going on the screen. Dr. Elizabeth DeNoma is the founder and editorial director of DeNoma Literary Services, providing editorial, translation, and publishing consulting services with a deep expertise in international literature. She has worked at University of Washington, where she also earned her PhD in Scandinavian languages and literature. She also worked at University of Wisconsin, Microsoft, Webster's Multimedia International Publishing, and most recently at Amazon Crossing as senior editor. She also regularly leads panels at publishing industry events, such as the London Book Fair, Book Expo, the Frankfurt Book Fair, and others. And in addition to this, she sits on the board of directors at Richard Hugo House and on the advisory board of the University of Washington's Translation Center. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to you and for you to introduce our speaker. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and enjoy the talk.
Thank you so much, Stina. Hello and welcome, everybody. Before we get started today, I would like to acknowledge that the physical location of the National Nordic Museum is on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present. And we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. Thank you. So we are very pleased to have with us today Swedish author Jan Stocklassa, author of The Man Who Played with Fire, Stig Larsson's Lost Files and the Hunt for an Assassin, translated into English by Tara F. Chase and published by Amazon Crossing in English. Can everybody hear me okay? Just a little thumbs up if you can. Great, thank you. I'm going to introduce Jan, and we'll have a discussion about this intriguing topic, which is really several intriguing topics. At the end of our conversation, we'll take questions from you, and there are quite a few of you. So if you wouldn't mind putting your questions into the chat functionality, which is right down there at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So capture your questions throughout the course of our conversation, and we'll address them at the end, the last 15 or 20 minutes of our session here today. And if you wouldn't mind just saying where you're writing from too, that would be really interesting for us to know. Thank you very much. So, Jan Stocklassa is a gifted writer with a rich and varied background. He's a former diplomat as well as a writer and journalist who focuses on large-scale affairs in international politics. Jan's first book, Gripen of Prague, was published in 2007, and it is based on real events that exposed corruption in connection with Saab and British Aerospace's attempts to sell Saab's supersonic jet fighters, Gripen, to the Czech Republic. In the aftermath of the book, police investigations were opened in 7 countries. But it was the book we'll discuss today, the best-selling and critically acclaimed The Man Who Played with Fire, that was Jan's breakthrough in English and a whole host of other languages in 2018 and 2019. It's been sold to more than 50 countries and translated into at least 27 languages, with several more, I think Hebrew and Turkish, in the works. Following the publication, the Swedish police actively pursued the leads presented in this book in the assassination of Prime Minister Olof Palme before bizarrely calling the case closed again recently. I had the great honor of working on the English language edition of this book, along with an entire team of marketing, PR, and other people. And in January, I was fortunate enough to travel with Jan to Jaipur, India, where he was presenting this work at the Jaipur Literary Festival. He drew great crowds and generated a fantastic following there. As the festival was wrapping up at the end of January, Indian news started featuring breaking news from neighboring China that the authorities were locking down a city called Wuhan because of an emerging viral outbreak of a novel coronavirus, which we are all too familiar with now. When Jan and I said goodbye at the end of the festival, it was with the understanding that he'd be touring here in the US all through the spring, and we would see each other where I am currently in Seattle. And that was not to be, as we know, that and so many other things were not to be during that time. But Jan, it is wonderful to see you again, if not exactly in the way that we had planned. How are you doing right now, and where are you?
I'm doing great. I'm in Stockholm, Sweden. I wish I would have been in Seattle now, but I'm at least virtually live with you. The situation here, maybe with the COVID situation, is actually pretty okay at the moment. So we lead a pretty normal life. We don't wear any mouthpieces, and we don't. There are limitations to what we can do, but we can go to restaurants, we can go shopping, we can go to small cultural events. So it's actually it's close to normal life given the circumstances.
Well, thank you for joining us here, because this is our cultural life right now. So we're very pleased to have you. Yeah. And let's dig into our material.
Okay.
So at the heart of this book, The Man Who Played with Fire, which, by the way, is available in the gift shop at the National Nordic Museum, is the assassination of Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme in 1986. Many of our guests today will know who Olof Palme was and his significance, but there will be some who probably don't or don't know it as well. So would you mind sketching out for us who Palme was and what role he played in Swedish politics from the 1960s until his assassination, and why he was a polarizing figure?
Yeah. In one sentence, I would say that Olof Palme was the greatest statesman of the 20th century of Sweden. He was, but as you said, he was polarizing. He was actually extremely polarizing given our cultural background. So he was also the most polarizing statesman in the 20th century, and probably in a couple of more centuries before that. I would mention the king that was killed, Gustav III, in the 18th century. Those two people were actually assassinated, and they were also probably the most polarizing statesmen that we have had in several hundred years. If you would compare to the US, I would say not as polarized as the situation is now in the US, but maybe something like with George W. Bush before the second election, maybe, or sometime when Bill Clinton had his problems with so the very polarized, and it was inside Sweden and also outside Sweden, because why I say that he was the greatest statesman is not because mainly what he did inside Sweden, but he was so engaged in foreign politics, and he was always on the side of small and oppressed countries against the colonizers, if it would be Britain, or the superpowers, if it would be the US or the Soviet Union, which led to several conflicts with the Soviet Union and also with the US. So to mention one example, at 2 occasions, the US have called back your ambassador from Stockholm. And both of those occasions was because of Olof Palme. It was in 1968 when he walked in a protest march against the Vietnam War, together with the North Vietnamese ambassador from Moscow, actually, for some reason. It was actually just by coincidence, but that happened, and then you called back your ambassador. The second time when he had a speech against the Vietnam War, in the bombings in Vietnam in 1972. So he was extremely polarizing outside Sweden also, and everything was coming to a climax in the late 80s, and that's also when he was assassinated on the 28th of February in 1986.
So he was this global figure, sort of outsized in Swedish political history, and I think for all of the Nordic countries. He had a greater footprint on the world stage. What was that like domestically? How did people perceive him there?
Well, the way he could do that was actually, he came from the upper class, who was extremely verbal, and he could actually take the scene also in the UN or in any circumstance, because he was well raised, I would say. But that was also a problem in his own Social Democratic Party, because they thought that he was sort of a strange bird in this Social Democratic Party, because he came from the upper class. He was actually a rich person. And from the other side, they thought he was a traitor, because he left the upper class, the bourgeois part of Sweden, and joined the working class. So he was strange in several ways, and then he was extremely intelligent. He actually had a really high IQ. Only Dolph Lundgren has had a higher, at least from the famous people of Sweden. So he was. So when he was debating, he actually became quite arrogant, because he thought that everybody else was a little bit more stupid, which was probably the case. But he showed it, and that was a mistake. And that was also why he was the first Social Democratic leader who lost an election in 1975 after 40 years of Social Democratic rule in Sweden.
But then won the next election, right? Or won a subsequent election.
Yeah, he came back and became prime minister. Yes.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of the order in which to approach these. Why don't we talk a little bit about what happened that night, like actually what happened on the evening that Palme was assassinated, for those who aren't familiar with that.
Yeah, it was 28th of February, and everybody who knows Sweden, far north, really cold winters. And so it was on the centigrade scale, it was -7, but there was quite a strong wind, so it felt like -15. Maybe you would translate that into Fahrenheit.
Very cold, that's how I would translate.
Yeah, close to 0 Fahrenheit or something like that. But no, not there, but really cold night. And Olof Palme and his wife were going to the cinema, and did what they sometimes did when they wanted to feel like normal people. They called off the bodyguards and went by underground from their home in Gamla Stan, which is just the old town of Stockholm, and 4 stops by the underground to a cinema called Grand. And where they got tickets, it was sold out, but they managed to get tickets because he was the prime minister. So anybody who would be seeing them going by the underground or just getting into the cinema would know that now the prime minister is there for 2 hours, and after 2 hours he will come out. So it's enough time to get a gun if you need to get one, to plan a murder or an assassination. And afterwards, after the cinema, they stayed for a while talking to their son and his girlfriend. And then the couple, Palme, Olof and his wife, started walking home. They decided to walk home alone without bodyguards. And
would that have been a long walk? Sorry to interrupt you.
That would be something like 2 miles, no, 1.5 miles. But they didn't go all the way, as you know. They walked around half a mile, crossed the street, and in total half a mile from the cinema, when a man walked up from the behind and shot one shot in the back of Olof Palme, and he fell to the ground and was already dead when he landed, and another one that scratched the back of the wife, very, very likely, actually. And then he stayed for a while before he ran into an alley up 89 steps and disappeared. And since then, nobody knows for sure who he was.
And how long was it before the police responded? How were the police notified, and how long did it take them to respond and come to the scene?
Well, they were called in quite quickly, but there was also a police car actually passing by coincidence. So they were there within a minute or two, actually. But from there on, everything went south. So they made all these mistakes. Somebody brought police dogs, and they said they couldn't use it. Didn't use them. They sort of closed off the murder site, but it was like something like 10 times 10 yards instead of 100 times 100 yards. So actually, private people found one of the bullets, and both of the bullets were actually outside this closed off area. So, and only the next day. So they made a lot of mistakes and didn't hear important witnesses and so on. So so already that night the problem started.
Yeah. Another center of your book is the extraordinary successful thriller writer Stig Larsson, whose research and communication about the assassination you were able to discover and use as your point of departure to create your own theories. So who was Larsson at the time of the Palme assassination in 1986, and what was his interest in it? How was he impacted by it?
Well, he was a 30-year-old wannabe journalist. He was actually an illustrator at the largest news agency in Stockholm. And as his hobby project, he was actually mapping networks of right-wingers and right-wing extremists of Sweden, because he was a fierce anti-right-winger, meaning Nazi and close to Nazi people. And he put a lot of time into that. And suddenly he was just in the center of the events, because all the journalists from this news agency, and there were a lot, came with information to him, because he was supposed to make a map of how the witnesses and how the murder escaped. And he got all the information the first day of the murder, and he immediately started thinking himself who could have done it.
That map is in your book, right? I remember it.
Yeah. It was published on the 2nd of March. So he worked for a day and then had already a lot of information from some of the best journalists in Sweden. And then he started doing his own research, and also realized that the police were actually looking at right-wingers in the first weeks after the killing. So he was already running in the first days.
And he was communicating with people about it internationally, right? I mean, you cite some of the letters of his that he sent in the immediate aftermath, I think.
Yeah. He actually started writing because he was actually really good at English, I would say, and he had good contacts in Great Britain, especially. So he was writing with his good friend Jerry Gable, who was the editor-in-chief of a magazine called Searchlight, where also Stig contributed frequently. And he started writing immediately after.
What kind of a publication was Searchlight?
That was an anti-right-wing magazine also. It was very much a role model for the magazine that Stig started some 15-20 years later in Sweden, called Expo. And Searchlight still exists, and Expo does as well.
Okay. Did you want to read us a passage from some of his letters to Jerry?
Yeah, because I wanted to sort of give an introduction to the story, and maybe the best one was written actually by Stig, because you could see already this is a letter from just 20 days after the murder. On the 1st of March, he wrote this letter, a 7-page letter where he describes what happened, the main witnesses, the main theories, and everything. And I'm going to just read a passage from that, and maybe you will sense the Steg Larson that you know from the Millennium trilogy. I suddenly found myself crying that morning. It happened when the desperate feeling of déjà vu hit me, making me realize that this was the second time in less than 3 years I had lost a prime minister, the first being Mr. Maurice Bishop of Granada, a man I love loved, respected, and trusted more than I do most. Not again. Then, putting grief aside and Mr. Palme below earth, it has come the moment when reporters suddenly realize what an absolutely splendid murder mystery type of schoolbook drama the entire case is. What a story. At moments, it develops with the speed of a Robert Ludlum novel. Other days, it turns out to be more of an Agatha Christie puzzle, only to develop into an Ed McBain police procedural touched off by Westlake comedy. The name of the victim, the political angle, the vanishing face of the killer, the speculations, the dead-end leads, the comings and goings of presidents and kings, the tracking of cars, the rumors and the crackpots and the knew-it-all-alongers, the phone calls, the anonymous tips, the arrests, and the feeling when you think the story is just about breaking, only to end up in nothing but confusion. Books are going to be written about this. Hey, maybe I should write a book about this.
Right.
Yeah.
And so books were written about this.
Yeah, so unfortunately, as you know, Stig didn't live to write the book. He died by a heart attack when he was 50 years old in 2004. And
but
then,
hadn't it been his plan to take up the subject again?
Well, he wrote it in this letter.
Yeah.
And he spent 18 years on and off doing research in the murder of our prime minister, and speaking to Eva Gabrielsson, his live-in partner, for 30 years. She said that definitely he would. And he actually did write about it. If you read the Millennium trilogy, in each of the books, the Palme murder is actually mentioned, more or less. And in the third one, it's becoming more and more tangible. So my theory is that it would be in number 4 or number 5, because he was planning to write 10 books. That was his plan, and each of them should have a slightly different structure. And as he describes in the letter, like with a role model, if it's Ed McBain or Agatha Christie, but that's what he wanted to do.
Right. And you came upon this treasure trove of research that he had done, and his theories and his contacts, and just all the work that he had done. How did you come upon that material initially? Yeah,
because that's what nobody knew, I would say, or very few people at least knew that he was interested in this, because there are many biographies of him, and you had the fights about the legacy and everything. So there've been so much written about him, but nobody knew that he was interested in this murder. And I started from another angle, actually. I was going to write a different book. And then when I was doing research in the other book, and then I found a paper that was actually written by him in an other archive, actually. And I asked someone who wrote this, because it wasn't signed. And the lady said, Stig Larsson, the detective, the crime writer. And she said, there may be more. And I continued looking, and it took actually another 6 months before I was standing in front of this rented storage outside Stockholm, together with the editor-in-chief of the Expo magazine, Daniel Poole. And when he pulled up this iron sheet door, there were 25 large cardboard boxes full of Stig Larsson's documents that had been packed down there immediately after he died, actually, and nobody had a look at them. And
how many of that? About the murder. How many of those 25 boxes had the Palme material in it?
I've gone through all of it, actually, the 25 boxes, and I have 3 or 4, this big ones, that I have scanned and actually treated, OCR treated, so I can search and find in them, find anything in them. And those are the most relevant, but there may be actually other threads in the rest of the material, because it sort of intertwines with his work on the right-wingers and right-wing extremists.
Right. So did engaging with Larsson's material change your perception of the Palme murder or the Palme assassination? Like, what had you thought leading up to that time, and then what did you discover in that material?
Well, I had been, like any good Swedish citizen, we trust our authorities and we listen to them. And they had said for 3 decades that it was the lone killer, Christer Pettersson, who did this. And so everything is fine. We didn't find all the evidence, but he was the killer. So that's what I believed also. I've been living outside Sweden also, so I didn't even follow all the twists and turns when they were thinking that it was the Kurds or the South Africans or whatever came up. So I trusted that, and I didn't know very much about it. And suddenly I found these papers where our most famous crime writer said it was a big conspiracy where South Africans were actually working together with Swedes, and I didn't know what to think, but I knew that I had to try to find out the truth.
Right. So let's just take a minute and talk about what the leading theories were in the aftermath of that. You touched on them a little bit. So the Kurds and South Africa, and then there was I think a lone gunman theory as well. So could you touch on each of those in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, there are almost as many theories as there are people looking at this. And someone said, and I actually also say that it's like a Rorschach test, you know, the ink stains that your psychiatrist want you to watch and see something sexual in. And the investigation of the murder is something similar. Because it's if you get 10 people to look at it, they see 10 different things, and it tells more about the person looking at the material than the actual solution of the murder. So when you get the policeman at the top who thinks already when he starts that it's the Kurds, which happened the day after the murder, he actually already had a working theory in his head. Then it is the Kurds, and it's a conspiracy among the Kurds. And then there was actually a sort of a pause in the investigations, and then they thought it was a conspiracy among right-wingers and South Africans with a middleman in Cyprus. And then there was the 33-year-old who was a lone killer, also in the first weeks of the murder. And then we had another lone killer, Christer Pettersson. And then South Africa has kept coming back. The CIA have been mentioned, the Iran angle, the Kurds, and sometimes the KGB. So it's you can pick and choose. You get all theories.
There are a lot of suspects. The cast of suspects is great.
Yeah.
But for each of them, what would the motivation have been? If we look at the Kurds as the initial suspects, what is the rationale for their having wanted to assassinate Palme?
Well, they did kill quite a few people, and they were the communist PKK is the Communist Kurdish Liberation Organization, and they were actually put in a restricted movement in Sweden into the towns where they were living because they were actually involved in all these crimes. So that would have been the motivation. That sort of the person who did that was Olof Palme, which was not true. Of course. Mm-hmm. So the motive was unclear, and they never got further. They put a full year into that with several hundred police officers working on it, and they never even got to a likelihood of that they were involved. So that wasn't a success. We lost a year there. Yeah, you know, the 48 hours, first 48 hours are the most important, and we were 24 hours or something. Here it's more like the first 34 years are the most important.
Right. What about the South Africa direction? What was the motivation deemed to be there?
Well, most people that have been looking at South Africa have said that, well, Olof Palme, he was a fierce opponent of apartheid, and he actually spent several decades fighting apartheid. And only a week before he was murdered, there was the People's Parliament against apartheid had a conference in Stockholm, where Olof Palme and Oliver Tambo inaugurated the conference. They actually walked in hand. So it's true, he was a fierce opponent against apartheid. But that's not enough to kill. Most people actually hated apartheid and were opponents, so that wouldn't have been enough to kill him, I think. I rather think which you will probably read more about. It's something much more tangible, and the dealings in those days with arms, mainly arms, going through South Africa to Iran, and those were deliveries that Olof Palme stopped. His government stopped several transports, and they were also he was also about to go public with what he found out about these transports. And yeah.
So a pretty compelling motivation there. And
yeah, that's definitely. Then there were actually a lot of political development that happened afterwards that would have been threatened if he would have gone public, including people in the US government.
mm-hmm. And what about the then USSR? That was a competitive theory as well for some time. What was the thinking there?
That's a little bit harder to explain why, because many right-wingers, especially in Sweden, thought that Olof Palme was actually a spy or an agent of the USSR, and he was going to travel to Soviet Union in April. And he had a sort of half-friendly relationship at that time with the Soviet Union. So why would they kill him? It's not really clear, but rather Swedish right-wingers could have had the motivation to get rid of him because of that he was traveling to Moscow, and they thought that he was going to sell out Sweden to become part of the Soviet Union, which is just ludicrous. That it's probably more probable that he was actually handing information to the Americans, because he actually had, behind the problems, he was actually a big friend of the USA.
Mm-hmm. And had studied here at Kenyon College, had deep relationships here in the United States.
Yeah. He saw issues with the American society, but that was because he loved the country. So, yeah.
Right. So in the course of following some of Larson's threads, you came into some stunning new information and followed a bunch of leads all over the globe, from the UK to South Africa to Cyprus. Would you talk to us a little bit about those, some of the information and leads that you developed?
Yeah, because Stig Larson, he did a great job in actually summing up. After 10 years, he summed up what he thought in an article, and also speaking to Eva, his partner, I learned much more from some of his friends. But what I realized was that he would most likely have gone to see these people, but he couldn't because he died. So I decided to do it instead, and that's not anything I've done ever before. So it was definitely stepping out of my comfort zone, and the first time I did that was when I went to Cyprus some 7 years ago now, to meet with the person that Stig Larsson claimed was the middleman in the murder. The person who was a Swedish person living in northern Cyprus, Turkish Cyprus, where there are no possibilities of extraditing a person. He's been living there from just before the murder, and he was working for the South Africans, and he was supposed to be a middleman. And I went there to see him, and the Swedish police, they had tried then for close to 3 decades to meet with him and never managed. But I went there, and I managed to find his house, and I managed to find his phone number, and I called him up, and in the end I sat for 3 days with him. So that was the first time I sort of stepped out of my comfort zone, and I was actually really scared, because in the memo that Stig Larsson handed in to the Swedish police about him, it says that rumor says that he has killed 6 people. So it's, yeah. So, but it worked out, and I got quite a lot of information from that, including that he confirmed that he was working for the South Africans. The second time was I went to South Africa, and I met Craig Williamson, the master spy of South Africa, the apartheid spy that everybody admired if you were on that side and feared if you were on the other side, and who knew Swedish people, and including people very close to Olof Palme, and the Swedish culture. And everybody says if it was the South Africans, he must have been involved. And then you probably think about the last one, Lida, also.
Yeah. And I'm thinking of how you got the name of the person that we call in the book Jakob Tedelin.
Yeah, because and that was sort of not a coincidence. I was looking, but I found a woman, a Czech woman, who was actually a Facebook friend of a person that I, by coincidence, found out was sort of played a minor role, and I asked her to find out more about this guy. And she actually handed over a lot of emails and also Facebook conversation with this Jacob Tedelin. And it turned out that he was a very close friend of the middleman in Cyprus. So suddenly these two were connected, which had never happened before. And I tried to interview him and I tried to get closer to him, and he rejected all those contacts. So in the end, I asked the same woman to actually infiltrate him, to meet with him undercover, and that's what she did. And she asked him a lot of questions and also got a lot of information about the murder of our prime minister.
Yes, that is one of the, I mean, the entire book is very gripping, but the sections in which Lida is wearing a microphone and meeting with Jacob are very tense sessions, or tense for me to read, because you just don't know what's going to happen there, and that's a lot of risk to be taking. You see that the questions are starting to come through in the comments, and that's great. So everybody who has questions, please put them in the chat box, and I will get to them right in just a few minutes. Thank you. There are lots of you. Were there any moments when you felt that things could get out of hand, since we're talking about Lida and we're talking about your being in Cyprus? Were there any times that you were worried or you felt in danger personally, or that she was in danger?
Well, I think it's more important when she was in danger or anybody else, actually, and those were the moments, because it was, I'd like to say that it was a calculated risk when she met with Jacob Tedelin, but there was still a substantial risk that something would happen, and she would be in his apartment. She spent actually several days there, so it was a dangerous moment, and I was there with a friend, and we were prepared, but there was nothing we could do if something happened. So that was definitely a dangerous, and sort of, I felt a big responsibility for her, and I sort of led her into that. It was easier when it was myself, but then, because I can just decide myself, I'm going to meet the middleman, and I did. And if something happens, it's my problem. Yeah. Right. Same thing in South Africa. South Africa is probably the most dangerous place. It's more dangerous even than some people in Sweden. Most people in Sweden, I would say.
So since you wrote the book and the police had reopened the case, what happened in the investigation that led them to the conclusion that they came to? And then let's talk about that conclusion for a moment.
Well, what happened some 3 years ago, or 2 years ago actually, was that we got a new prosecutor. 3 years ago we got a new prosecutor, and 2 years ago he said he will present a solution. And what we didn't know was that they had already decided what the solution was, and they met. So Christer Peterson was the new prosecutor, and he stepped out, and he was the first one in 3 decades to say to the Swedish public, it wasn't the drug addict Christer Peterson who killed the prime minister. I don't believe that. It's just bogus. That's the prosecutor Christer Peterson saying that. Same name. He didn't want the same guy, a guy with the same name to kill the prime minister. And he said, I will present the solution. And then January or late January or early February, he came out and said, in a few months' time, before the 30th of June, we will present the solution to the murder. And we will present substantial new evidence, and everybody will not be happy, but this will be the solution. And everybody was stunned. Why do you do that? It's like it has never happened before. Usually you say next week, or you say today, or something like that. But he gave himself several months. And so everybody was sort of calculating, he must really be sure of himself, and they're only tying the knots together and everything. And then there was this anti-climax on the 11th of June when they sat down to poor men, the chief prosecutor and the head of investigation, and they had this pretty ugly PowerPoint presentation with maybe 25 pages where they went through what has happened during 34 years and what they thought were the evidence about that it was the Scandia man, another lone killer who had been working very close to the site and had been a witness and had been in contact with the police very early on, and how he was the killer. And that was a huge surprise. But even bigger surprise was that they didn't present anything new. Everything that was presented was old information, mostly 3 decades old information. So immediately, I would say that the most disappointed were the ones that believed in the Scandia man, because they were saying, now the police will give us right, they will show why everybody else was wrong. And they were extremely disappointed because there was nothing new and no hard evidence at all. So
the Scandia man is called that because it's this person who worked for an insurance company called Scandia, is that right? He happened to be in the vicinity.
Which was actually the building that where on the corner of that building Olof Palme was killed. So he was actually really close to the site.
And you said like there's no new information, so no new motive, no new like materials with linking him to.
And actually everything that they presented was actually this PowerPoint presentation. And then a one-page decision, we terminate the investigation. So it was this. So if you in the US after John F. Kennedy was killed, you got the Warren Commission half a year later, 900 pages. Lee Harvey Oswald, yeah, you may like or not like that solution, but you got 900 pages of written information. We got an ugly PowerPoint after 34 years.
So that sounds anticlimactic and a little disappointing. Yeah. What was you had told me that you had reminded me that that conference was going to take place, so I attended it virtually too. Mm-hmm. But what was the reaction on the ground there?
Yeah, I think everybody was disappointed. Even maybe the 2 guys who had the information, they were probably really happy afterwards that they were out of it. But maybe they were also disappointed because maybe they were actually expecting that more people would say that, oh, that's great that you have solved the murder. But no, I don't think anybody would say that they have done that. Not even the people that believe it was the Scandia man.
Right.
And I met with the head of investigation only 10 days ago because I handed in a lot of information, and they actually acted on some of the information in the last 2 years' time. But I met with him for lunch to sort of wrap up 10 days ago, and then I asked him, so tell me what you think. And he said, well, of course, I think it was the Scandia man. He couldn't say anything else. And then he said, I only see 3 problems with it. And that's, first, how come he had a gun with him, and where did he get it from? Second thing, what was his motive? We didn't find a real motive. That it wasn't enough that he didn't like Palme, because 50% of the people in Sweden didn't like Palme. And the third thing was, how come he knew that he should get out just at the moment when the couple were passing, because that's what sort of happened if he killed Palme. So what he didn't realize, the policeman, was that he was actually naming the means, motive, and opportunity, and that there were problems with each of them, and that's sort of the basis to have a suspect here. And that's just where it starts. So I think there are a lot of problems with that solution, and they know it.
Yeah. Right. So considering that, do you think there'll be any further investigation? I mean, they declared the matter closed, but do you think there's any likelihood that conclusive evidence might emerge at some point, or that the police will reopen for any reason?
What happened now, the good thing is that they sort of played their cards. They had a pair of twos, And they played it and said, here are our cards. The problem now is that they have to hand out the 50 other cards. They have to hand out all the whole investigation. They can sort of black out, redact some things, but most of it should actually be public, and that's what's happening now. And people are gathering it in one place. So it's actually happening that you get access to a lot of papers that haven't been accessed before. So I'm doing some things, and I'm working on a new project where it connects into this one. So hopefully in the new book there will be some new information, and I actually think that there's a big chance that something will happen through this, that this new material is published. Also.
Good. Can you tell us, would you share with us anything more about the project that you are working on right now?
Well, yeah, I'll do that. But first, I'd like to have I prepared a small surprise here.
Oh, good.
But I need to take on my COVID-19 gloves for that, because if you believe in a lone killer, you have to sort of narrow down everything, zoom in on a few witnesses, and that's what the police done. And then you can, in the end, say it was the Scandiaman. What they don't take care of is everything around it, which I think that you have to do, because the witnesses are actually really poor from the murder site. So, for instance, they forgot about 75 observations of walkie-talkie men. Not 75 men, but 75 observations in the time from when Olof Palme left his home until late in the night there. And many of them are actually impossible to get rid of. So there were people with walkie-talkies there. And who were they? And if you would have 2 walkie-talkies, it's already 2 people, and then it's by definition already a conspiracy because it's not a lone killer. So last year, I actually remember that there was, I heard a story about some young people that actually found a walkie-talkie. And after the book was published, I contacted through several people before I got to them. And we handed in last Easter a walkie-talkie to the police. And it's this walkie-talkie.
Wow.
We just got it back because the police were convinced that it was the Scandiaman. So they didn't really do anything. I actually asked the head of investigation what they did, and he said, I don't really remember. I think one of our guys called an expert on walkie-talkies, but they didn't give anything. So they didn't check the serial number. They didn't check for DNA. They didn't do anything. But this is a walkie-talkie that was found very close to the murder site 2 days after the murder by some young guys. They didn't hand it in at the time because they were young guys that were into rock and roll and drinking. So they didn't hand it in, and instead they kept it. And we handed it in only a year ago. And it's a pretty cool thing. But I also think
that's a piece of technological history right there. That's a substantial walkie-talkie.
Yeah. It's got an antenna of 5 feet, something like that. So it's a cool piece of equipment, but it's also something that I truly believe is actually a part of the murder conspiracy, where people were actually communicating with walkie-talkies.
Yeah, it doesn't look like a casual piece of equipment that you would just happen to have around for recreational use.
It was an amateur one, but they were still pretty expensive. So you can see I've checked the frequency and everything. So it is an amateur one, but it still would be a few $100s to buy at the time. And it's not something that you drop or just lose like that. And the police they didn't even try to find the owner of it.
Interesting.
So that's just another example of what the police didn't do, but what we can do now, because
and just there are a bunch of questions that are coming in now, so I'm going to start to share them with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
One person wants to know, how difficult is it to buy a gun in Sweden?
You have to be a member of a shooting club, and then you can even buy a handgun, so you can shoot. So, and the gun used in this case was a revolver, a Magnum .357 caliber, and with special ammunition breaking through metal piercing ammunition, which is not the right type, which is one sign that even the gun is a strange choice of. But it is not so easy, and it's usually traceable, or so very few guns that at the time that were untraceable. Now it's a different situation though.
Yeah. At the time, how hard would it have been to get a gun in the black market or something illegal?
Not as easy as now, but you would have. There were, of course, guns available also in that black market, and they've tried to locate many of those that were. But for instance, there's one person towards the end of the book that did own, according to his wife, he did own all the time a revolver with the right caliber and by the brand Smith & Wesson, which is the most likely brand of that type of revolver.
And another person asks, have you been able to get a sense firsthand for what Palme's closest friends and family think the answer was behind the murder? Has anyone come forth with their opinions about that?
That has sort of shifted a little bit over the years. As long as the widow of Olof Palme lived, after close to 3 years, they found a lone killer called Christer Pedersen. And by sort of tricking her into identifying, I would say, she actually identified that person and said, that's the guy who killed my husband. That sort of came gradually. But it was also, I believe, a way for her to get closure. But when she said that and stood behind that, which she did until she died 3 years ago, her family also said the same thing. But as soon as she died, the son started actually saying that they were not so sure about it. So they have sort of shifted in their view. So it's a terrible trauma for that whole family, and it's something that is really hard to get around. A lot of these rippling effects around the murder, that so many witnesses and so many people that have been sort of living with this trauma for different reasons. Yeah, and they are a few of them. Yeah.
Another question is, could you speak briefly about the right-wing presence and motivations in Sweden? Here in the US, Sweden is seen as a positive model, not only in caring for its citizens, but also as a happy society. Is this a rosy American misperception?
Well, it's hard to, if you speak about those days, I would say that there was, the right-wingers themselves would mainly say that they were anti-communists, and it was still the Cold War. But they were also quite hardcore. So there was this was sort of a place where it wasn't really a war by proxy, but the presence of the Russians and the Americans and the Western powers was actually quite a lot of them in Sweden. So there were quite a lot of this, and the right winger, and the opposition against Olof Palme was actually quite hateful. So in that sense, it was not a peaceful society in the days of Olof Palme, and especially not towards the last years. When he died, everything settled down quite quickly. The new Social Democratic Prime Minister, the successor, already got a much better dialogue with the opposition. Proposals that were made by Olof Palme's government were scrapped, and everybody got along much better. So after that, there was a while when it was still this, you say that the rosy picture was slightly more true. And now we have come into a situation where, like many countries in Europe, where there are a lot of polarization also, mainly through the immigration and the opposition against immigration and xenophobia and things like that. So it's much more complicated than it used to be. But we are sort of an international country living on trade and with the US and with a lot of other countries. So I think it's something that is actually mostly positive. But it leads to more conflict in society also.
Right. We have only a couple more minutes, but I did want to ask you what your experience briefly was in publishing this book in so many different languages. I mean, there are very few authors in in the world who have sold into as many languages as you have, sold as many books as you have. So if you can encapsulate that entire experience into a few minutes.
Yeah, it's like that's a tough one. No, it's like a roller coaster, because I've been sitting in my room in front of my computer doing research, sometimes meeting someone. Nobody was interested. Everybody who heard about what I was doing thought I was crazy and laughing at me. And suddenly I sort of finished the book, and there's a podcast being produced, and there may be a documentary. And next week we're having a call on a fiction movie. So it's based on the book. So it's been like the only thing I really miss is going to the US on a tour. So that's why I'm working so hard on my next book, actually.
Well, we can't wait to talk to you about that when that becomes a possibility. Thank you so much. It's really been lovely to talk with you again.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. It was great talking to you too.
I want to make just a couple of concluding comments before we sign off. First of all, thank you everybody for joining. And we're coming to the end of the Zoom session. So I'll thank Jan again for sharing his insights and story. And I'll thank all of you for taking the time to join us today. And I'd like to remind you that we have two more sessions in the Meet the Author series in 2020. One on November 3rd, we'll have Professor of Archaeology at Uppsala University, Dr. Emil Price, to talk about his most recent book, A History of the Vikings, Children of Ash and Elm. And on December 1st, we'll be joined by Danish author and activist Lisbeth Zornig Andersson, author of Anger is My Middle Name, her memoir, along with her translator, Mark Musari. And if you are in a position to do so, please consider making a donation to the National Nordic Museum through their website. It's a fantastic organization with a impressive and wide array of programming. As Tina was saying, just this month, they're having a documentary film about collective memory and different perspectives on a shared colonial past between Denmark and the US Virgin Islands. There's that talk about the exhibition of Edvard Munch's experimental photography, which sounds amazing. And there's a celebration of Finnish sauna culture, and also a virtual session about crafts and cocktails that Stina mentioned. So I'll thank you all once again for joining us today, and I'll see you next time, if not before. And Jan, I hope to talk to you again very soon.
Yeah, we will. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.